Hi everyone. Okay, so it's our last lecture, and I got to admit this always makes me sad because this is one of my favorite classes to teach. I hope you guys have enjoyed class. Please don't forget to fill out the course evaluation. Remember that you guys get 6 extra credit points for that. We are grading as fast as we possibly can with regards to your exam, and you should have it back either tonight, which is Sunday night, or tomorrow, Monday night at the latest, or yes, you'll get extra credit, but we'll definitely have it back to you by tomorrow night at the absolute latest. And you guys know where you stand. Okay, the other thing I still have to do is add in the other extra credits you guys have done so far. And so you remember you get 5 extra credit points from the last exam. I've not added that in yet. Yo, you guys get a lot of extra credit in this class. I just gonna realize that. But that's fine. I want you all to enjoy the class and to have fun and not to stress. Okay, so that's the ultimate goal. But anyway, so don't forget all those points that you guys get. And I'm going to do my best between tonight and tomorrow to make sure you all are caught up and you know where you stand. I will have office hours again. I'm trying to think of when it would be most useful to you. Definitely the day before the exam. I'll make an announcement on that as soon as I figure it out. So anyway, this is our last lecture. There's no reading for this lecture, by the way. There is reading, but I'm not that worried about it. We're just going to go over the material that I expect you to know together, okay? So you probably often hear a term called biodiversity, okay? And basically it's another way to think of biological diversity, okay, which is a way of describing a community. So you consider a community to be diverse when it has many different kinds of critters living there, okay? So, and you can actually measure diversity in a couple of different ways. So as you're thinking about the different ways that we tend to measure biological diversity, okay, so what I want you to do is think through both of these communities, Community 1 and Community 2, and then think about which one would you consider to be more diverse, okay? So take a minute, choose your answer, pause lecture, pick your answer, and then start up again. Now, to be honest, I've not really given you enough information to address this question, but most likely, just intuitively, you guys probably chose Community 1 as being more diverse. And for obvious reasons, you know, that's a good choice because we're dealing with 25% of each species rather than having a community that's dominated by just, 2 species and then just counting a couple of additional ones. There's a big difference. So the reality is the best way to address this question is first to be able to distinguish between species richness and species evenness, okay? So species richness is the number of species in a given community, and the reality is between both of these communities, they both have 4 species, okay? But the reality is evenness is the relative proportions of the different species, okay? And so a term that actually combines the 2 of these is called species diversity. So species diversity tends to be what we use, and it combines information on species richness and species evenness. So it gives us both of those perspectives in one value. So with regards to does biodiversity matter? Well, honestly, I'm biased, but my answer to that is an overwhelming yes, okay? So we have a lot of what are called ecosystem services, and these are basically services that the natural world will provide for humans. And of those, there's 4 main categories. There's known as provisioning, write this down, ecosystem services, provisioning, that provides food and water, provisioning, yes, I'm also a child of generation spell check, food and water, regulating, which is control of climate, pests, and disease. Number 3 is supporting, which is like nutrient cycling, crop pollination. That's why we were so worried about the bees. And then cultural. So spiritual, aesthetic value, recreational benefits, and all sorts of other good stuff. So we use nature for aesthetic value. Now, I don't know about all of you. I swear I'm never going to watch the news again lately. I just keep getting headaches. And then I go out to my garden and I try to appreciate biodiversity there. Okay, and so that would be aesthetic value. Crops and livestock, this provides the food that's on our table. All right. Realistically speaking, medicines, all of our medicines, those of you that want to go into medical school, by the way, know your plants because at least initially, many of our medicines are derived from plants. All right. Ecosystem services. We like things like clean water. I'm a big fan of clean water. I want clean water. Okay. Well, wetlands will actually pull out a lot of pollutants and so forth and clean up our water, which is greatly appreciated. Also, material and design ideas. Okay, I don't know if any of you are architectural majors or anything along those lines. So, scientists actually use sandcastle worm adhesive to reconstruct bone. How cool is that? All right. So there's a lot of uses that we may or may not appreciate nature for, but to be honest, we really should. So you might be asking yourself, do species richness and functional diversity affect species primary productivity? And I would say, aha, that is an excellent question. So a few years back, actually many years back, starting in the mid-1980s, yes, before most of you were born. Anyway, there was a researcher who was a grad student here apparently at the University of Michigan, and that was actually before my time here. And he was specifically addressing the question of, do high species richness and high functional diversity of species increase aspects of ecosystem function? So in other words, the more species you have, does the ecosystem function better? Okay, and he would measure this based on primary productivity in particular. All right, and so primary productivity, if we tend to think about it, is the amount of biomass that's produced above ground. Okay, so functional groups, in case you were asking, you can have many different species of grasses, but grasses tend to behave a certain way, and therefore grasses by themselves are considered a functional group. You can also have legumes because they fix nitrogen. They're another example of a functional group. They're basically just species of plants that do these jobs. Woody plants, another functional group. Forbs produce lots of seeds, okay? And so he came up with this really, really clever experiment back in the 80s at the University of Minnesota, the Cedar Creek Ecosystem Study. And believe it or not, some of his plots are still actually being observed today. So pretty cool stuff, but this was his experiment that he designed. What he did was he looked to see if you had one species, okay, and then if you had multiple species but the same functional group, and then if you had multiple species and multiple functional groups, how does this actually impact primary productivity? All right, so it's a pretty clever question and a pretty awesome experiment. And if you guys take general ecology, you will definitely revisit this again. So make sure you understand this now, okay? And that way later on in your future classes, you're like, I got this. So this is what his plots actually look like. Okay, it's an aerial view. They're about 13 by 13 meters in size. They are grassland prairies dominated by grasses and other angiosperms. And so the posts that are surrounding the plots are likely sprinklers so they can add a water treatment. Okay, and so again, remember the question he was asking, does species diversity and functional group diversity and all that other good stuff make a difference with primary productivity? So the answer to his question, by the way, is a resounding yes. And so what he found was that biodiversity does affect primary productivity of ecosystems. So what he measured again was above ground biomass. Now plant biomass, we tend to measure above ground biomass and below ground biomass separately. Sometimes, because it's a lot easier just to cut off the vegetation at the surface and measure that than have to pull out the roots and then separate them from the dirt and all sorts of other stuff. I mean, it's not impossible, but it's just difficult. So above ground biomass is basically just all of the plant material that is above ground level. And so as he was looking at the plant biomass for species richness, again, the first thing you do is you read your axes. You can see here that the more species that was in an area, the higher the plant biomass mass was. Now again, it does plateau out, and that should come as no big surprise. Okay, eventually you kind of hit the maximum of what an area can do. Then you look at the number of functional groups added. Okay, and once again, definitely is an increase. Okay, so what this suggests is biomass or species diversity does have a strong influence on biomass and productivity. And so, I mean, we've hypothesized this for a long time. We've said for many, many decades now that, having species richness and so forth is actually good for an environment, but this was one of the really solid, concrete experiments that showed it, which is what made it so cool. Okay, guys, so let's put those chart skills to use, okay? So I want you to pause lecture, and I want you to summarize this set of data. And the other thing I want you to do is read carefully your axes, okay? So take a moment, pause lecture, and then when you're ready, go ahead and start up again. Now, there's an emphasis on the y-axis for this, okay? This is showing a difference between plots with higher plant diversity versus plots with lower plant diversity, okay? So positive numbers, which everything here is positive, by the way, means that the treatment results increased biomass compared to the plots with low diversity. There's another way to present the data, okay, and it's actually on the previous slide. Those first three blue bars were, adding those particular species, okay? The other thing to note here, though, is that they added nutrients, which is in green. They added essentials, which is in purple, and then there were other treatments in red. All of these treatments resulted in an increase in biomass compared to a plot with single species. Now, you might be thinking that it's weird to see that fire increased biomass, but remember, this experiment was done on prairie communities, and prairie plants are adapted to fire, and very often they even require it for germination. Okay, so what I want you to summarize out of this is that biodiversity impacts ecosystem productivity. Write this down. Biodiversity impacts ecosystem productivity as much as resources like nutrients, disturbance, and herbivory do. Okay, so biodiversity impacts ecosystem productivity as much as resources like nutrients, disturbance, or herbivory do. Okay, so make sure that that makes sense and go back and keep looking at this if you have to until things start to click. You've got to know how to interpret scientific graphs because you're going to see them in all your upper level courses if you haven't already. So the next time you guys go wandering through a natural area, okay, I challenge you to think about, if you go to a particular spot, what determines what species and critters do you see there, okay? So what determines if you find a field with grasses, like on the left, or if you find a forest, like on the right? Well, there's two different components that really have a big impact on this, and one of them, actually many different components, but we'll break them up. The first is abiotic factors, okay? Temperature, precipitation, okay? Those generally, by the way, tend to be the two largest determinants for plants in different ecosystems, but also light makes a difference, soil makes a difference, nutrients, pH, and all sorts of other good stuff. Okay, so those are the abiotic factors. Now, biotic factors like competition, parasitism, predation, mutualism, hopefully this all sounds familiar, and you all know that this makes a difference in community composition. Okay, and then don't forget things we've not had time to cover yet, like succession, disturbance, the size of an area, that makes a difference too. Geographic location, these are all important drivers of what, makes up what causes individuals to be present and absent from certain areas. Other things as well, like dispersal, okay? How do different species disperse? That makes a big difference too, as far as who's going to, make up an area. So there's a lot of different factors that determine community composition. So the next time you guys go out, you're in a natural area, think about this, okay? It kind of gives a really cool perspective about what nature is really like and all of the factors that play into who's living in there. So now it's time for us to cover what's called the latitudinal diversity gradient, okay? There's some really cool patterns out there as far as biodiversity and their relationship of communities to the equator. All right, and we'll get to the chance to talk about those now. Okay, so I know you guys know the answer to this because I'm sure you've heard many times. Biodiversity is really high in the tropical rainforests, and there's a couple different hypotheses that attempt to explain that. But given this information, okay, which of the patterns is dominant in nature? Read through your axes, take a look, and when you're ready, circle your answer, pause lecture for now. Hopefully you chose C, okay, because remember the equator is at 0 latitude, and it's the highest diversity there, and then as you go away from the equator in both directions, your biodiversity decreases, okay, which is actually fascinating from a scientific perspective. So remember, this is called the latitudinal species gradient, okay, and so as you move away from the equator, species richness declines, and species richness tends to be highest in the tropics. So there's all sorts of interesting hypotheses why this might be, and I want you guys to write these down. Did I mention write these down? Because you need to write these down. So one hypothesis or cause is that the high species richness is associated with high solar inputs and plenty of rainfall. High species richness is associated with high solar input and plenty of rainfall, which leads to high primary goodness productivity, and that supports a diversity of species. High species richness associated with high solar inputs, plenty of rainfall, leads to high primary productivity, supports a diversity of other species. That's the first hypothesis. The second is that the tropics are basically a cradle. So the idea is that their tropical habitats are older. They've had more time for speciation. They weren't really subject to the most recent ice age. Okay, so they didn't really follow the same pattern as a lot of the northern ecosystems did. The third hypothesis is that the tropics are basically a museum. They have lower extinction rates because the climate is really stable. Okay? The higher latitudes, you have higher extinction rates because you have glacial cycles causing, environmental conditions that fluctuate, and it's not as stable. That's the third hypothesis. That one's called Tropics as a Museum. Scientists have to name everything, as always. Okay. Also, hypothesis number 4, that stronger biotic interactions. So critters evolved to avoid predators and parasites and so forth. And number 5, terrestrial tropics occupy a larger area, more niches, more resources, more species. You guys get the idea. So it's basically the species-area relationship. Now, the reality is there's no current consensus. There's a lot of work that's addressing this topic. These hypotheses are not necessarily mutually exclusive. So there was one recent study that was focusing on ants, and they found evidence for the tropics are a cradle and that they're a museum. Okay, so you definitely can have multiple hypotheses explain these patterns. But either way, it's actually a pretty cool pattern. And given the fact I used to do most of my research in the northern forests of Alaska and Canada, it's really pretty interesting. It's a fascinating contrast. Okay, so let's talk about the latitudinal species gradient of land plants. Once again, the equator is at 0. What I want you to do is to take a moment and draw the best fit line on this scatter plot. Okay, so, and it shouldn't differ all that much from what we've already talked about. So the reality is that tropical forests provide habitat for millions of species. Okay, and so they have millions of insect species and other invertebrates. They have a huge diversity of fungi, lots of mutualisms going on. Huge diversity of vertebrates, birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, all sorts of assemblages of archaea, bacteria, protists. I mean, seriously, how cool is this? Okay, and so, so many of these critters do incredibly well in this environment, and it really makes things interesting. So let's talk about what's known as species-area relationships, okay? And this is also a really important one that I want you guys to carry with you when you take an ecology level, upper-level ecology course, because it's really important. And so basically what we're showing here is a species-area curve for North American breeding birds. Okay, and keep in mind that both the area and the number of species are plotted on a logarithmic scale. Those of you that have had statistics know that this is just to make it look pretty. Okay, and so those of you that haven't, you'll get to learn that later. Okay, so, but what's interesting about this is a very general pattern that holds across taxa. So all else being equal, okay, in other words, all the other factors you're going to assume are the same. Direct sun at the equator, lots of precipitation in the tropics, that type of thing. If everything else is equal, and the only thing you're changing is the area that you sample, you will sample also a greater number of species. Okay, and this should make sense because the more land you sample, the more species you're going to detect. Okay, and so, but that's what this means. So the species-area relationship, this is a well-known concept throughout science, and so make sure that this makes sense to you. So given this information, okay, why should species richness actually increase with area? Take a moment, pause lecture, think through this. The thing to consider is that the more area you sample, the more niches or different type of habitats you're going to have, therefore you're going to increase in species number. Okay, additionally, if you're sampling more and more area, you're likely going to have higher colonization of these areas and lower extinction. The other thing to keep in mind is, by the way, is this is not necessarily mutually exclusive. You could have both of these. Okay, so again, make sure that this makes sense and that you're comfortable with this concept because you're going to see it again throughout life. Okay, so it's time for us to focus on ecological disturbances and successional processes. And cross out the microbiome, by the way, because we did that in last lecture. So you've already got those slides. We've already gone through it. I just mixed things up a little bit. I wasn't 100% sure if we'd get to lecture 18, given the way everything was going lately. So, but yay, we made it. So you might be asking yourself, well, how often do disturbances occur and how severe can they be? Okay, so the reality is we categorize, because it's what we do in science, and we categorize them by the intensity and then the frequency. Okay, and it should make sense that a disturbance, write this down for a definition. Disturbance is something that opens up physical space in an environment. This is independent of the density of critters. This is something like floods and fires and hurricanes and tornadoes. Okay. Remember, it's independent of the density, so it's going to impact the population whether it's large or small. And this is review for you guys because you guys are awesome and you know this. Okay? Now, the most severe means it's high intensity and high frequency. The least severe means it's low intensity and low frequency. Okay, so I can tell you when I was working, so I used to live in Illinois, and Illinois is kind of the border of Tornado Alley. And I have seen many tornadoes actually come through certain areas. And I kid you not, when I was in high school, there was a tornado that was on one side of my parents' house, and I was dumb enough to be outside watching, which tells you I probably should be taken out by natural selection. Anyway, so I'm out there watching this tornado, and I kid you not, it lifts back up into the sky, skips my parents' house, and about a mile down the road lands again and knocks down a subdivision. It was the craziest thing I had ever seen. Okay, so I was very grateful to have lived through that and not have my parents' house get wiped out, because again, I was in high school. Another tornado story I can tell you, again, natural selection really should have wiped me out by now, is that there was a time when I was in grad school at the University of Illinois and we had the tornado sirens going off. The sky was green and purple, I kid you not. It's relatively normal when you're out there. And then the sirens start going off, which in Illinois means that someone has seen a tornado somewhere, okay, and somewhere nearby. And so I headed up with a bunch of my faculty that were my instructors. Rather than going to the tornado refuge and cellar, which is what we should have done because that's what normal people do, we headed to the roof to go look for it. Oy. Don't do that, by the way. Be smart. Don't do what I did. So the scientist in me sometimes takes over, and that's not necessarily a good thing, okay? So as I said, y'all be smart. Don't do the things I did. But, you know, we tend to get curious as scientists to see what's going on in the world around us, whether it's a good thing or not. Now, the reality is we don't have that many tornadoes around here, and I'm honestly okay with that, having grown up with tornadoes in my lifetime. But on August 2nd, 2015, there was a rather large storm in Glen Arbor, Michigan, which is right near Sleeping Bear Dunes. We were talking 100-mile-per-hour winds. Blew over many, many trees. Areas that used to be fully forested are now filled with downed trees. Okay, so light reaches the understory. You can see how many of the large trees were fully uprooted at the picture of the bottom right. Okay, so what do you think is going to happen to this site over time? Well, most likely it's going to repopulate. It's just going to depend on who gets there first. Okay, and then who can do well in that particular environment and so forth. And so it's kind of a race to see who can get in there and fill that gap. And by the way, there's an entire field of science called gap research or reforestation, however you want to consider it. I'm blanking on the name right now. But basically they study if you have a gap in a forest, who's going to come in and repopulate that area, which is actually, from a scientific perspective, very cool and incredibly useful because trees get old and die just like everything else, or you have disturbances like this which make a big deal, or I'm sorry, which make a big difference in community composition and so forth. So forest fires, by the way, are also disturbances, and generally you will have a disturbance history in a fire-prone community. One example is giant sequoia groves, and you can determine this from tree rings, by the way, which is pretty cool. So giant sequoia trees can live up to 1,000 years old, and you can use tree ring analysis to measure the age of the tree, of course, and look at how many disturbances happened in the past. The small and less intense fires don't kill the mature trees, okay? It takes the big crown fires to do so. The other thing to consider too is prairies are fire prone and fire adapted. They actually, grasslands and prairies need fire. They're supposed to have it. Okay. Pine forests like lodgepole pine in Yellowstone or jack pine in northern Michigan, those are also fire prone and adapted to frequent fire. So you might be asking yourself, how in the world can something adapt to fire? Well, they have what are called serotinous cones, SEROTINOUS cones. And basically, they need fire so they can open and the seeds can disperse and then germinate. So it's through serotinous cones that certain species are adapted to fire. Now seriously, how cool is that? You have a tree that knows that there's too much competition around until a fire comes in and sweeps through and gets rid of all the competitors. So it has serotinous cones that won't pop open until a fire's been through, and it knows that the nutrients have actually been released and there's way less competitors. Guys, we got to give nature props for that, because it's so fascinating and interesting that, you know, trees that we normally don't even think about can do something so cool. Okay, so let's put those math skills to work. Yay! Okay, once again, I'm never going to try to trick you, but you guys need to be able to solve problems like this, okay? So on average, how often did fires happen from 1200 to 1600 AD? Okay, so pause lecture, read the axes, address this question, and then when you're ready, start us up again. So let's talk about how to solve this. Okay, so remember I said read the axes. That's what you should always do. That was also a hint, because it's number of fires per century. So at 1200, we'll say there's approximately 25 fires per century, which if you divide 25 by 100, this means 0.25 fires per year. Okay, so that actually comes out to a fire being every somewhere between 2 to 5 years. But it's certainly not every 10 years, it's certainly not every 20 to 50 years, and certainly not over a century. And at 1600, the number goes up, so it fluctuates. It's like 30 fires per century. Once again, it's between 2 and 5 years. Okay? Now, given this information, what happened in 1900? Human settlement, okay? And I can tell you, when I was a kid and I was growing up, Smokey the Bear was out all the time. He was all over the place. Only you can prevent forest fires. I don't know if you guys grew up with him too, but you know, Smokey was always talking about preventing forest fires and not having a campfire stay burning and all sorts of other good stuff. So the reason fires crashed so much was because human settlement, and then we would take over areas, and of course we don't want fires to happen if we have homes built there. Now in 1988, and yes, I'm old enough to remember this, as my daughter likes to remind me, I'm old. Okay, so there was the Yellowstone fire. And so there were massive fires that burned for several months. And in fact, they closed the park for the first time in its history. This happens, by the way, when you suppress forest fires, because what happens is a phrase, well, it's named fuel loading. Write this down. Fuel, like burning fuel, loading. Okay? When you keep suppressing forest fires and keep suppressing forest fires and keep suppressing forest fires, you get all of this fuel that builds up. So if a fire ever actually happens, it's enormous because it has so much fuel to burn. Okay, so as far as like what management option is the best, should you have, you know, controlled burns? Yes, I hate to say it, but you should, because you got to get rid of that fuel. People should also, unfortunately, whether they want to or not, they should burn land around their houses responsibly so it doesn't spread. But that way, if a forest fire does start, it doesn't go towards their house. And there's really no easy answer for this. I mean, prairies have had fires, forests have fires. Okay, this is a natural part of it. But the reality is that, unfortunately, right now it's not sustainable because it costs so much money to put out these fires, and, you know, taxpayers have to pay them, and there's really no easy answer for this. However, again, you know, this is something that you have to deal with, and your generation is going to have to deal with it. Sorry, guys. My generation didn't help with this, so you guys got to figure it out, okay? So it's all you to figure out how to deal with, you know, massive forest fires and what the best management practices are. And maybe technology is going to help with that. I'm not lying. I'm kind of going to cross my fingers on that. Okay, so when you have a recently burned area, you will have elk coming in, okay? And then after year one, you'll have wildflowers that will bloom, and there's even something called fireweed, which is so cool. okay, because it comes in and it just blooms and it's really beautiful. Then, almost 20 years after the fire, you'll still have many dead trees, but you'll also have lots of pines and so forth in the understory that are going to grow up and then eventually replace those dead trees, okay? And they'll make use of all those nutrients that get recycled, which is pretty awesome. So you guys have heard of the term succession, okay? Succession is when you have plants that go from one species to the next species to the next, and generally it happens in a relatively orderly fashion, okay? Primary succession means you're starting with bare rock, so glaciers that recede. They dump rock, and the bare rock has to be colonized and so forth by mosses that break the rock down, and then other plants move in once the mosses, move out, and so that's primary succession. Secondary, it would be like an old abandoned farm field where you've already got soil there, okay, and because you've got soil there, you're not starting from scratch to have to build the soil, but you're going to have new species coming in after some sort of big disaster like farming. I'm not saying farming is a disaster, please don't get me wrong. I do appreciate our farms, okay, and I have lots of friends that are farmers. But when you abandon a field, or when you're farming a field, you take out the species that are naturally found there. And then a field gets abandoned, and it kind of has to start over with regards to who's going to colonize it. Okay, so those weedy species, by the way, are generally the ones that colonize it. So given this information, is the succession considered primary or secondary? By the way, it's secondary because you have soil. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. If you're starting from bare rock, then that's primary, but not in this situation. Even with a major burn, you still have soil there. So remembering that secondary succession is when you already have soil there. You might be asking yourself, what trait would be more important for a pioneer species, okay? So pioneering species, by the way, those are the first species to establish at a new site. Write this down. Pioneer species, first species to establish at a new site. Okay, so given that information, which is more important, do you think? B. Okay, so dispersal is actually more important there. All right. Now, if you happen to be curious, weedy species are classified as weeds because they grow well in disturbed soils. Write that down too. The other thing I want you to know from succession and so forth is that some pioneers will make conditions more favorable for later species to move in, and that process is known as facilitation. You can kind of think of something like that as, if you have siblings and you're the oldest sibling and you have to be the one to fight with your parents to have a longer curfew, and you might get frustrated because your little younger siblings might have a way easier time than you did. I've heard many stories of that, by the way. So that's facilitation. Okay. Other situations, you might have pioneers that make conditions less favorable for other species coming in, like inhibition. If you're the older sibling and you cause too much trouble and your parents clamp down on the rules, you might inhibit your, younger siblings from getting to do anything. I was an only child, sorry. So I can't really have too many life stories with that. It's just watching my friends, okay? The other thing I want you to realize is those early species tend to be short-lived, long dispersal distance, and a high reproductive rate. Lots of kids, okay? Lots of other small plant species, plant seedlings. They can also have to tolerate high levels of direct sunlight because no one else is there. The larger and longer lived critters, those are the ones that are good competitors, and they move in later, okay? There's also a lot of other things that go into this. Abiotic factors tend to be important to figure out what plants grow where. All right, so again, temperature and moisture tends to be the two things that will determine plant distribution. So it's not really the biotic factors like we think it would be. All right, guys, I'm sad to say this is our last lecture. You guys know I love teaching this class with you. It has been such a fun semester. I'm sorry you guys were panicking about the exam grades. You guys did fine. You rocked the exams again, okay? So we just had a slight glitch. I muted the grades as we were trying to grade, and for some reason, we muted it probably 5 times between all of us, and something happened and it just didn't take. So, but I hope you enjoyed the class. I love teaching you guys. You were an awesome group as always, wicked smart. You rocked the exams. You did super well. Hopefully we will start up again in the fall, okay, as normal. And if you guys ever need anything, I'm in 3108 USB. You should totally come and see me, okay, if you're on campus, because I want to see you guys. Half the reason I go into teaching is because I love interacting with you. And if you ever need anything, I'm always there for you, okay? So I hope you guys enjoyed the class. It was a lot of fun for me. Again, come see me, and if you need anything, definitely let me know. All right? Have a good rest of your summer.